text of the gospel, there's this shocking moment that most of us almost surely missed because we are not like first century Jews. It's this shocking moment where Jesus starts talking about being free, and the Jewish folks who are there push back and say, "What do you mean? We are descendants of Abraham. We have never been slaves." To say that is to deny like the most core root part of the Jewish experience, right? Like the Jewish experience is outlined in the Pentateuch is this idea that they were slaves in Egypt. God chose them as his people and led them out of slavery to the promised land and freedom. Everything starts there with the Exodus. And yet, part of what's going on is they've forgotten who they are, and by forgetting who they were, they forgot who they are. And Jesus is trying to remind them of that in the moment. It's why he comes down so hard next. And you know, today's Reformation Day, a day that most of the mainline Protestants, minus Moravians and Episcopalians for their own historical reasons, celebrates as the day in which the Reformation began as Luther went ahead and did his thing. And pretty much most of mainline Protestant will lead back there. Now, when I say mainline Protestants, I always like to highlight it. We're talking like the UCC, the Presbyterians, us Lutherans, the Episcopal Church, the Moravian Church, Disciples of Christ, Northern Baptists, also known as American Baptists. You follow who I'm talking about, right? That group. And here's the funny thing about that group, which we're part of. Most folks who are mainline Protestants have bought into a false history of who they are. What do I mean? Well, if you talk to evangelicals or you talk to atheists, they don't really agree on a lot of things, but one thing they do really agree upon is that the mainline Protestant world is the Mr. Magoo of Christianity. I now know who knows who Mr. Magoo is. Okay. The evangelicals will say Christianity is this, and they'll describe themselves. The atheist Gnostic community or secular community will be like, yeah, that's exactly what Christians are. Because they both want to have a big fight. But there's this entire chunk of us mainline Protestants, that don't fit into either category, that have faith that is active in the world and is not joined in sort of evangelical dream. And so both groups will describe us as this sort of hapless, unable to get our act together group of Christians that really don't matter because we don't really do anything because we're so far behind the times on all the issues that by the time the mainlines finally get around to doing it, everyone else has done it before them. Right? Sort of incompetent is how they describe us. And yet, if we know our history, we would know that this description is completely false. We're going to talk about our history then and our history now, and how this idea that somehow we're this irrelevant people sort of going through life not knowing what we're doing is just not who we are when we look at the facts. So let's start with some stories out of history of mainline Protestants and how we have lived. So you all know I love history, so you got to go with me in my time machine. We're going to go back to 1862. Set the time period. So far, the South has fully succeeded from the Union and has had mostly victories in most of their encounters with Union forces. But the South has figured out there's a major problem that they're up against they haven't figured out, which is the naval blockade of the Gulf Coast and all the coasts, north and south. This is strangling the economy of the South. They cannot get weapons in. They cannot get food in. They cannot produce enough weapons or enough food to sustain their armies. Okay? And they can't figure out how to get out of this. They have no way to build ships. And so the Army of Texas comes up with an idea. Their idea was simple. We'll march through New Mexico because the Union has stripped all the western forts of their soldiers. We'll go to California, which was a state back then. We'll capture Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego. We'll use their dry docks. And we'll build a Confederate Navy to break the blockade. It will take time, but with major ports on our side, they could do it. And so the Army of Texas headed off. blasting one group after another of Union forces out of the way. Now, there was a Methodist dean, okay, who realized the danger of this endeavor. So he went to his what will become United Methodist congregations and rose up a regiment of 450 cavalrymen. And they saddled up. And because he understood what was going on, he knew the Union forces in the West were going to lose. And so in the great battle that occurs in Apache Canyon, the Union forces run into the Confederate Army of Texas, and the Confederate Army of Texas destroys them, leaving an open path to take out California. But on that same day, that Methodist pastor and his forces attacked the supply line, burnt all the food, threw all the gunpowder that the Confederates had brought with them to back them up into the water. 3 days later, even though they had been victorious, they had to retreat and march across the hot, scorching deserts of Texas and New Mexico. Why? Because people of faith stood up. People of faith said, we cannot stand by and let the institution of slavery live. And they were willing to sacrifice their life because they believed in God that strongly. Those folks were mainline Protestants. 1890s come around, so we'll go forward a few years. You have this great industrialization across the world, but with industrialization comes slums and cities, and comes the need for health care as there's one pandemic after another, cholera and typhoid and polio, as people congregate in these new urban centers across the United States. How many of you all have traveled around the country and seen different hospitals and noticed that they're named things like Methodist Hospital, Presbyterian Hospital, St. Luke's Hospital? This is because mainline and Catholic brethren came together and said, we need to establish a hospital system to help people, knowing that neither the government or private corporations or anyone else was caring enough to do that. Not only did they do that, but Mary Seacorn and Florence Nightingale, the founders of nursing, were both led by their faith in God as mainline Protestants to found nursing. So, by the way, was founded social work. These are people in the 1890s in congregations like the one you're sitting in today that looked out, saw problems, and said, well, hey, God is leading me to fix it. And they did, because of faith. Now you may be thinking to yourself, hey, Pastor, that's great. We were super active in the 1890s, 1860s, but what about today? Aren't we still sort of the Mr. Magoo, just maybe recently? My answer would be, oh, heck no. So let's go forward 100 years. Let's go to 1970. Now, some of you might have been alive in 1970. I wasn't, but many of you probably were, right? Okay? Now, in 1970, the LCA and the ALC, which are two of our three predecessor bodies, got together and started ordaining women within days of each other, basically. Okay? And making them pastors. Now, some people say, but the 1970s was a progressive time. Women could do all sorts of things. And I was like, really? They can? Because in 1970, they couldn't have a checking account, folks. It's not until 1973 that Title IX that allows women to do sports even happens, let alone is enacted. Like, let's understand, if you think we were late to the game in the 70s, all of sports must be irrelevant. And we know that not to be true. We were ordaining women before women could play school soccer. We were putting women in positions of authority over faith communities before women could play baseball. We were not just relevant, we were ahead of our time. And God bless us for doing that. I always like to note to the evangelicals, I'd love it if you get around to catching up to our 1970 version of us, because you're still not ordaining women. You may say, okay, well, 1970 is long ago. You weren't even alive, Pastor. Okay, fine. Let's go to 2009. Now, in 2009, the ELCA in August of 2009 went ahead and said, we are going to allow our pastors to perform same-sex marriages. And we are going to go ahead and allow the ordination of same-sex folks who are in same-sex committed monogamous relationships to become pastors. Okay? what was then termed gay rights. Now, many of you may say to yourself, well, wasn't 2009? I mean, this was a settled thing. Oh, heck no, it wasn't settled in 2009. Quick history view. In August of 2009, we do that. A month later, the first legislative victory for gay rights occurs in the state of Vermont in September 1st, 2009, where Vermont, by legislative vote, decides to allow same-sex marriage. Means we got there before Vermont. We have always been and continue to be relevant. Whether or not you like the positions or not, you can't say they aren't current issues. We continue as people of faith, turned on fire by God, to go out and make our place a more compassionate, more loving, more caring world. Whether or not it is suiting up and fighting Confederates, whether or not it is building a hospital system, founding social work, founding nursing, fighting for women's rights, or for those of all sorts of communities that have been marginalized. We have stood up again and again and again, and not in some lagging indicator, but as a leader in these things. And this is who we are as mainline Protestants. People enacted by their love of God to love their fellow humans. So never take a moment and buy into the false narrative that we are the Mr. Magoos of Christianity. We are the folks on the cutting edge of the future each and every time. We were in 1860, we were in 1970, we were again in 2009. This is our legacy. This is who we are. It is once we realize who we are, or at least who we were, that we can truly begin to ask the question of who we are. So as you go out today, everyone carries tons of different labels with yourselves, right? We're mainline Protestants. We might be people who do soccer. We might be people who love football. We might be Eagles fans or Dolphins fans. I know, I'm a Dolphins fan. I know, I have issues. You are all sorts of things. You know what those are. But I urge you to take a minute, look at all the ways you define who you are, and make sure you know those histories, those pasts, the stories of your families, your organizations, your groups you're part of. Because when you know who you were, then you have a chance to know who you are.